We've been waiting for an iPad version of Final Cut for ages now, and with the hardware being as powerful as it is nowadays, it was weird seeing the Pro market so neglected. That's until last week when Apple announced that Final Cut and Logic Pro is finally coming to the iPad. The zero fanfare of the announcement had me worried that the app will not be that great, but since it's now available for everyone to download, we can find out ourselves. So, is Final Cut for the iPad a worthy sibling of the desktop version? Let's talk about it. Apple's more tame announcement was definitely a good way to manage expectations. The app overall is promising, but it also has a lot of limitations and quirks. If you're going to use it for rough cuts when you're out and about, or as a way to edit mobile phone videos, I think it's a perfectly fine application. But for more complicated things, the desktop version of Final Cut is needed. Can we create a complex video with the iPad version? Probably yes, but it's going to be an infuriating experience. Let me explain. The first thing that comes to mind has to do with the whole project workflow, how we import footage, and how we manage the library. For example, we cannot edit off of a drive or a NAS like we can do with a desktop version. We have to import everything to the Final Cut library and then start editing. This workflow change alone adds an insane amount of preparation time. We cannot just sit down and start editing. The good news is that all types of importing methods are supported. External drives, network drives, cloud drives, they're all there. For example, we can just connect an SSD drive to the iPad and import whatever video, audio, or image files we have there. The same goes for network drives. I had no problems connecting to my NAS and adding files from there. But if you have a lot of big files, this step can take a considerable amount of time. Let's take as an example this file I'm importing from the NAS. Granted, I'm using Wi-Fi instead of an Ethernet connection, but if you could just use linked files, we wouldn't have to do this sort of thing. The file is 35 gigabytes in size, and from what you can see from the screen recording, it takes a while to import. So yeah, prepare for some long importing sessions. Of course, if we just use local storage like an SSD, it doesn't take that long to import. Thankfully, exporting our edit for the desktop version of Final Cut is a much more forgiving process. There, we have the option to not include the files. I was extremely happy when I saw that. This option has two benefits. First off, the FCP file is just a couple of megabytes in size. But most importantly, this way we don't have to deal with duplicate files. So when we open up the desktop version, we can just relink all the assets and we're good to go. That's exactly how I like to work, and I'm happy that Apple offers this option. I even save the cache outside the FCP file, so archiving a project is a really simple process. If Apple could get rid of the unnecessary importing step when first setting up the project, it will make editing on the iPad a much friendlier way of working. We can already read and write to external drives with the iPad. Why not just let us edit off of them? I'm sure there's some limitation forcing the app to work this way, but this extra step adds more friction than what's necessary. We basically have to import twice to edit once. We have to import the data to the iPad, and we also have to import data to where the actual project will live on the desktop. But yeah, it is what it is. Let's now move on to a couple more things that I feel make Final Cut Pro for the iPad a difficult program to work with. The major issue for me is the fact that even though the desktop and the iPad version share the same name, they're completely different beasts. They do share enough similarities to make you feel comfortable, but at the same time, they have some completely different workflows. Of course, that's understandable. We're working on a tablet and a small screen, so things have to be reshuffled. But there were a lot of times where I was scratching my head trying to figure out how to do certain things. Let's take as an example adding keyframes to a piece of audio. On the desktop version, we have several ways of doing that. First off, we can hold down the Option key and click on the audio timeline. We can add all the keyframes we want, and then we just drag down to lower the volume. Another way is to create a range and then lower the volume that way. Final Cut will create the necessary keyframes automatically. When I first tried to adjust the volume on the iPad, I tried the manual keyframe option. And that doesn't seem to work at all. We have no way to add keyframes to the audio. Only video-related keyframes are available. Thankfully though, the range option does work. That's until it doesn't. On regular clips, this method works fine. But once we have multicam clips, we cannot adjust the audio at all. For some reason, multicam clips on the iPad are treated differently. On the desktop version, there's no issue whatsoever. We can adjust the audio of multicam clips however we want. I need the multicam option because I record video and audio separately, so I cannot just use the audio from my camera. It would sound terrible. Even a simple thing such as adjusting the overall audio from a multicam clip is not possible. But let's say that this is a unique workflow only I use, even though that's certainly not the case, but let's pretend for the sake of it. There are still several other limitations. For example, notice the timeline video preview. On the iPad, we don't really get any feedback there. We just get a small thumbnail, and that's about it. That can be incredibly limiting because seeing what comes next is a very fast way to edit. For example, notice this part. At a glance, we can see the changes in the timeline, and we can easily cut the part that is not needed. But on the iPad, we just see the simple thumbnail, and we have to scrub the timeline to see the next part of the video. And the same goes for the audio waveforms. The previews are not accurate. On the desktop, it's pretty easy to edit parts out. For example, here, I know already that I've messed up. There's big gaps of silence, and the waveform right after looks the same as this one. So I know I did a second take of that. As a result, I don't even have to watch that part. I can edit it out without even hesitating. But on the iPad, the audio preview plays tricks on us. We have to be very zoomed in order to get accurate audio waveforms. Have a look at this section. Here, if we look at the waveform, it looks like I'm saying something, but as you can see from the video, nothing's happening. We have to zoom in to get the better preview. So even though these things might sound like minor annoyances, they have a huge impact on editing speed. Usually, I can edit the talking head parts really fast on the desktop, but on the iPad, it takes me double or triple the time. Granted, I'm not yet super familiar with the app, but even if I knew it inside out, I would still be slower on the iPad. Another annoying issue has to do with color grading. That's a super important piece of the puzzle. I use Vlog to shoot my videos. It has a very flat look and it makes controlling the final look of the image very easy. On the desktop, color grading is perfectly fine. Final Cut has some good color grading tools, and we also have the option to use plugins. On the iPad though, the color grading options are extremely limited. First off, the log processing looks incredibly wrong. That's not how the colors should look. But let's pretend for a second that the output is correct. If we try to adjust the colors and the exposure, we will get some really weird results. Things will start clipping, colors can't be shifted a specific direction, and so on and so forth. So where does that leave us? We cannot really edit audio that well, we cannot work with log files that well, and we also cannot edit that fast because of technical limitations. So the way I see it, Final Cut for the iPad is good only for rough cuts. You just work on the broad strokes of the video. You do a first pass of the A-roll and maybe sprinkle in a couple of B-roll footage, but the bulk of it has to be done on the desktop. Is the idea of working on a rough cut worth the hassle of having to wait a long time just to copy the files to the iPad? I'm not so sure. I like the idea of being able to edit on the iPad, and the device is certainly capable, but at the same time, the way the app works is not ideal. I think I have to work with it a little bit more to draw a more concrete conclusion, but I don't think my opinion will change that much. But you never know. I certainly hope though that Apple will keep improving these areas at a steady pace. What is there has a lot of potential, but it still needs work. For example, I would have loved to see a two-way communication between the apps. Currently, we can only go one way, from the iPad to the desktop, so grabbing a project to work on the go is not really possible. On the plus side, the foundation seems to be on solid ground. Everything performs really well, and the exporting times are also really good. For example, exporting a video from the iPad is faster than my computer. That's to be expected since my Mac is 7 years old, but it's still funny to see. As for the pricing, I think it's fair what Apple is asking. I would have preferred if it was a one-off purchase, but it's understandable. If we want Apple to keep developing Final Cut, it has to somehow fund that development. I'm afraid though that this means a subscription version for the desktop is coming. It'll be annoying to see it, but I'm also not looking to change software anytime soon. So if it comes to that, I'll have to pay for the service, but only for the desktop version. Maybe I'll use the iPad version for a month or two just to familiarize myself with it, but beyond that, I don't feel it covers my needs. So why pay for something I won't use? But what do you think? Is this current version of Final Cut what you wanted, or do you also find it somewhat limiting? Let me know in the comments below. And I think that about wraps things up for this video. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.